think of ourselves as the most powerful beings in the universe, it's unsettling to discover that we're wrong. Time has come to see the world as it is.
Can we pull back the veil of static and reach into the source of all being? Behind this curtain lies this random pattern generator. You will be responsible for an escalation that will destroy everything.
On this episode, I'll talk some more about the so-called ultra-terrestrials, or crypto-terrestrials, or Faerie Folk, or aliens, or whatever. I recently remembered something a good friend of mine told me years ago. He said that he was lying in bed with his girlfriend when he saw a little man crouching down on her nightstand staring at her. He freaked out and yelled, "Do you see that?" And she just nonchalantly answered, "Yeah, so you can see him too?" And he's been with me for a while now. Not everyone can see him. He said that the little man was semi-transparent and was wearing simple clothing, like a kind of drab robe, had curly dark hair and jet black eyes. He said that it would just stare at her intently, even when he would wave his hand in front of it, its black eyes would never stop staring at her and no one else. My friend couldn't deal with the little guy, so they went out to her living room couch. She told him that her mom took a trip to Asia. He couldn't remember exactly where in Asia she was. And when she was there, some local spirit beings of the area took an interest in her because she looked different from the locals and attached themselves to her and proceeded to follow her back to the States. One of these beings took an interest in her daughter, my friend's girlfriend, and started following her around. Days after my friend told me this, I would say, okay, you got me. Yeah, that story about the little phantom guy, yeah, cute. Yeah, okay, you made it up, right? Okay, you got me. And you'd be like, no. No, he would insist that he did not. Now, years and years later, he still swears that it happened. Continuing with the subject of mysterious little people, I should mention a rather little-known aspect of Parisian history and culture, the Little Red Man of the Tuileries. Reports of Napoleon Bonaparte's encounters with Le Petit Homme Rouge suggest a working relationship in his rule of the French Empire from 1804 to 1814 and again in 1815. The Little Red Man is also credited with predicting Napoleon's failures at Waterloo, Fontainebleau, and the scrapped invasion of England. Apparently, he also visited Josephine to let her know that she would be Empress of the French. Popular tradition asserts that the palace of the Tuileries had been for centuries the resort of a demon, familiarly known by the name of L'Homme Rouge, or the Red Man, who is seen wandering in all parts of the chateau whenever some great misfortune menaces its royal inhabitants, but who retreats at other periods to a small niche in the central tower built by Catherine de' Medici for the use of her royal astrologers. Now that came from the Courtier of the Days of Charles II, with other tales, by Mrs. Gore, from Bawdrey's European Library, 1839. And this next account comes from William Walsh from the book Red Spectre of the Tuileries, American Notes and Queries 1:11, Saturday, July 14th. Published Philadelphia, W.S. and H.C. Walsh, 1888. This goblin, known also as the Little Red Man of the Tuileries, is said to haunt the palace and its adjacent building, showing himself on the eve of disaster. His first recorded appearance was a few days before the 10th of August, 1793. Marie Antoinette's women were sitting in the salle des gardes when they became suddenly aware of the presence of a small man, clothed from crown to heel in scarlet, who looked at them with such unearthly eyes that they were frozen with terror. They rushed to the apartment of Madame le Dauphine and related their adventure. And this comes from William Shepard Walsh, and was in Heroes and Heroines of Fiction, classical, medieval, legendary, famous characters and famous names in novels, romances, poems, and dramas, classified, analyzed, and criticized, with supplementary citations from the best authorities. Published Philadelphia, J.B. Lippincott Company, 1914. He visited Napoleon at Cairo, shortly after the Battle of the Pyramids, and predicted to the little corporal his brilliant destiny. Chamberlain's Anecdotes of Napoleon and his Court tells this story. In the month of January 1812, the winter preceding the Russian campaign, the Red Man asked a sentinel if he might speak to the emperor. The soldier replying in the negative, the demon brushed him aside and ran quickly up the steps. He said to a chamberlain, "Tell the emperor that a little red man whom he saw in Egypt wishes to see him again." Napoleon admitted the petit homme. A long conversation followed in the private cabinet. From a few words that were overheard, Napoleon seemed to be pleading for something which was refused. Finally, the door was opened. The Red Man came out, passed quickly through the corridors, and disappeared on the grand staircase which nobody saw him descend. Béranger celebrates this spectre in a poem entitled Les Petits Rouges, supposed to be spoken by a charwoman who had done duty in the Tuileries for 40 years. And now this account comes from the London Daily News, March 31st, 1883, pages 153 to 154. He was last seen during the Commune. The old watchman who had charge of the building was going his rounds one night when he became aware of a scarlet-clad figure in the gloom, skulking behind one of the pillars. He made for it, but it seemed to pass round the pillar and disappear. He looked about everywhere, but there was nothing. The old man had his own reasons for thinking that he might have been deceived on this occasion, so he took nothing but coffee after dinner next night before making his rounds. Yet there was the red man again. This time he was leaning meditatively on his arm and looking down on Paris. The watchman shouted at him. He turned around, faced him with the same look of icy woe, and disappeared. The old man ran for help, late as it was, and they made a thorough search of the place. They did find something red. Their search ended in sauve qui peut, as they saw the first glare of the incendiary fire that was to reduce the Palace of the Tuileries to a heap of ruins. And now I'll read an article about the Little Red Man that was posted to unmyst3.com. The Little Red Man, posted by Tripsibit, February 3rd, 2011. According to legend, the ghost known as the Little Red Man appeared to some of the nation's most notable personalities for more than 260 years, garnering a reputation as a harbinger of tragedy. The ghost seemed to center its activity in Paris at the Louvre and Tuileries palaces. It is mentioned in scores of books, official records, and even Napoleon's diaries. Catherine de' Medici is said to have been the first person to have confronted the apparition. It was in 1564, during the construction of the Tuileries, that de' Medici came face to face with a gnome-like creature dressed completely in scarlet. It soon became apparent to haughty Catherine that her unannounced companion was not a man of flesh and blood, and she interpreted the strange visit as an omen of bad luck. As Catherine had already begun to foment troubles between Roman Catholics and Protestants in France, and she induced the king to order the terrible St. Bartholomew's Day massacre of the Huguenots, scarlet was an appropriate color for the ghost to have worn. In 1610, the Little Red Man appeared to Henry IV just before the monarch was assassinated by an insane schoolteacher. In 1792, startled chambermaids discovered the scarlet-clad gnome in the bed of Louis XVI when the threatened king was making a futile attempt to escape the machinations of the French revolutionaries. A few months later, guards came to have seen the little red ghost in the prison where Louis and Marie Antoinette awaited their turn with the guillotine. In 1798, the red-hued entity first appeared to Napoleon during the military leader's Egyptian campaign. The spirit is said to have materialized before Napoleon and to have made a bargain with the ambitious officer. According to the terms of the contract, Napoleon was to enjoy victory and triumph on the battlefields of Europe for a decade. The Little Red Man seemed to follow Napoleon through all of his campaigns and provided a rough map of some of the events of Napoleon's life. People at the Tuileries were familiar with the stories of the Little Red Man of Destiny appearing to Napoleon while he stayed at the palace. The strange visitor said that he had advised the rulers of France in the past, and declared that he had appeared to Napoleon in order to counsel him as well. The ghostly advisor told the military genius that he had been at his side since he had been a schoolboy. Quote, "I know you better than you know yourself," the spirit chided him. The entity told Napoleon that his orders to the French fleet had not been obeyed. While the Egyptian campaign had begun on a note of triumph with the pyramids, the ghost told him that the enterprise would fail. Napoleon would return to France and find her closed in by England, Russia, Turkey, and an allied Europe. As the Scarlet Ghost predicted, the Egyptian campaign failed. In 1809, after the Battle of Wagram, Napoleon made his headquarters at Schönbrunn, and his mysterious advisor once again appeared to him. Napoleon had conducted 10 years of successful campaigning, and he asked his supernatural advisor for 5 more years of guaranteed triumph. The ghost granted his request with the admonition that the greedy conqueror should not launch a campaign that would take him on Russian soil. Napoleon ignored the warning and met with a disaster that proved to be more significant than the physical defeat he suffered at Waterloo. The Red Ghost made his third and final appearance before Napoleon on the morning of January 1st, 1814, shortly before the emperor was forced to abdicate. The gnome first appeared to Councillor of State Molay and demanded that he be allowed to see the emperor on matters of urgent importance. Molay had been given strict orders that the emperor was not to be disturbed. But when he told Napoleon that a red man wanted to speak with him, the emperor asked for the mysterious stranger to be granted immediate entrance. It is said that Napoleon beseeched the ghost for time to complete the execution of certain proposals, but the prophetic messenger gave him only 3 months to achieve general peace, or it would be all over for him. Rather than attempting to bring peace to Europe, Napoleon desperately tried to launch a new eastern campaign. Such a move left Paris to fall into the hands of the Allies, and on April 1st, 3 months after the Red Man's final visit to the emperor, Talleyrand and the Senate called for Napoleon's abdication. In 1824, the ghost's last reported appearance occurred when Louis XVIII lay dying in Tuileries Plaza. The mysterious gnome-like apparition has, however, earned itself a strange but secure position in French history. Oh, it says the source of this is Real Ghosts, Restless Spirits, and Haunted Places by Brad Steiger. Okay. I suggest you look up more about this little red man yourself. It's really fascinating. I also know that Napoleon would wear a vivid crimson cloak with an elaborately decorated hood and lining. Perhaps an homage to his little advisor? Or maybe even ordered by him to wear it. And now, the news.
What the hell in God's name is going down here?
In late February 1963, 30 to 50 miles off the north coast of Norway in the direction of Spitsbergen, a very strange radar sonar event occurred. Ships from the British Royal Navy North Atlantic Fleet were engaged in exercises, and on this particular morning, the witness was in charge of the radar sonar room on a frigate. A blip denoting a solid object appeared on the radar scope, and the indications were of an object 100 to 120 feet across at a height of 35,000 feet. It appeared suddenly, an impossibility for a conventional aircraft, but the witness said conditions were not favorable for the anomalous propagation of false targets. It was learned that the same target was also on the scope of the nearest ship, but outside the witness could not locate the object through binoculars, nor could he make contact with it by radio. Jets were sent up to intercept the object, and when they were 10 to 15 miles from it, the men in the radar sonar room saw its radar blip make its steep angular descent at great speed, crossing all three radar screens and going below the radar horizon of 750 to 1,000 feet, all in 2 to 3 seconds. Following loss of radar contact, an underwater target was picked up on sonar, indicating an object moving fast at about 10 miles distance and in the same direction as the radar target had been moving. The object dropped into deeper water, moving fast in a zigzag path away from the ship, and after a few moments, contact was suddenly lost. The ship steamed to the point where the object had entered the sea, but nothing was seen and no further contact was made with it. Reports of possible USO activity have also come from all the coasts of Britain, off England, Wales, and Scotland. Lifeboats have frequently been called out when flares have been sighted offshore, but nothing has been found and the flares remain unaccounted for. It seems to occur regularly off the English coast of East Anglia, Norfolk, and Suffolk. In May 1975, something more solid was found by accident. A dredger 30 miles off Gorleston, Norfolk, struck a submerged object in water nearly 150 feet deep. The propeller was slightly damaged. The ship went back using echo sounders, but nothing could be found. A strange sighting from the west coast of Britain was reported by Gavin Gibbons in his book The Coming of the Spaceships. The location was the coast of Dyfed, Wales, and the date was 24th March 1955. Quote, "It was at 7:15 p.m. that Mrs. Harding, a farmer's wife of Aberarth, was called outside by her young daughter, who was pointing excitedly at the evening sky. She gazed out over the sea in the direction that Rosalind, her daughter, indicated. There, to the northwest of where they stood, and well out to sea, was a large orange ball giving out a black trail and zigzagging downwards. They remarked that it looked very like the sun, except for the movement in the long, black, smoky trail that streamed out behind. As they watched, it exploded, and, still in the shape of an orange ball, plunged into the sea. The strange thing was that they could still see it glowing beneath the surface of the water, and this continued for upwards of an hour after the object finally struck. The trail that it had left behind changed from black to gray before it dispersed. Neither of the two watchers had heard any sound from the ball, either in the air or in the sea. A similar object was seen that evening from a coastal position some miles north, near Tynwyn, Gwynedd. The two witnesses reported that after dropping into the sea, the bright orange object shot up into the sky again, leaving a gray trail behind it. But it is not clear whether, or not, they were watching the same object as was seen by the witnesses at Aberarth. Across the English Channel to France, where off the Normandy coast, the crew of a French fishing boat saw a large, black, bird-like object fall from the sky one July day in 1910. It fell into the sea, bounded back, fell again, and disappeared, leaving no traces. South in Portugal, where on 6th July 1965, the commander and crew of a Norwegian tanker saw a large, cigar-shaped object fly out of the sea off Puerto La Cruz. It was glowing blue and had a row of portholes with yellow lights. 16 years later, a short distance to the south and just over the Spanish border at Isla Cristina in the province of Huelva, two boys saw a light emerge from the sea about 1,000 feet offshore. It was the night of 8th February 1981, and their attention was first caught by a light rising up from the depths. The light was getting brighter and brighter, which made us think of a submarine, they said, but suddenly it came out of the water and stayed still at a height of about 500 meters, or 1,600 feet, disappearing without a trace soon after. Further east in the Mediterranean, there has been a considerable amount of USO activity over the years. On the 26th of July 1970, a diver fishing off Aljucibre in eastern Spain was in the water 25 to 30 feet deep and 200 feet offshore when he found a strange metallic cylinder about 20 feet long lying on the seabed. He examined it closely, trying unsuccessfully to move it, and was also unable to scratch it with his knife. Early the following morning, he was rowing in the same area when his companion saw something leaving the water. A few hours later, when the diver went down again, the cylinder had gone. He was sure he was in the same spot and was a very experienced diver. 8 years earlier, a very strange encounter with a USO had taken place in the Mediterranean, one of the very few such cases involving entities. The location was the fishing port of Les Brusques between Marseille and Nice in southern France, and the witnesses were fishermen. 3 of them were out in 2 boats late at night on 1st August 1962 when they saw what seemed to be a submarine moving slowly across the surface of the water. Some quote-unquote frogmen were climbing out of the sea onto the craft. One of the fishermen called to them with a loud hailer. They were about 1,000 feet away, but they did not respond, except for the last man, who turned and waved his arm. Then after he had gone inside, the craft rose above the water and hovered there, with red and green lights shining. A white searchlight beam shone towards their boats. Then all the lights went out, the craft glowed orange and began to rotate, faster and faster, until it shot off its speed and vanished among the stars. The fishermen were flabbergasted and very puzzled. Quote, apart from the noise of the waves, we had heard no sound from it, and you can well imagine that we asked ourselves what it could possibly have been. It was not a submarine, nor a helicopter, nor a seaplane. We would have certainly seen it if it was any of those. On October 11th, 1973, in Pascagoula, Mississippi, Charles Hickson and Calvin Parker were fishing from an old pier in an abandoned shipyard on the Pascagoula River. Shortly after nightfall, Hickson, looking around to bait his hook, saw a domed, football-shaped object descend until it hovered just off the ground about 30 feet away from them. The large craft had 2 windows and 2 blue lights and made a buzzing sound. When the object landed, an unseen door opened to reveal a brilliantly lit interior. 3 beings came out and floated toward the witnesses. These beings were about 5 feet tall. Their skin was so gray and rough like elephant skin that they looked like mummies. No clothes were apparent. On their faces was something about 2 inches long that came out to a point and resembled a nose. They had a slit for a mouth which never opened. If they had eyes, Hickson couldn't see them, as the area above the nose was too wrinkled. They had no neck, and their ears were pointed and retractable. Their arms were unusually long, and their hands were like mittens with a thumb attached. Their legs never moved but stayed together like a pedestal. Their feet were elephant-like. When 2 of the beings grabbed Hickson by the arms, he felt a pain in his left shoulder. This immobilized him and allowed his captors to lift and float Hickson over and into the craft. The 3rd being seized Parker, who immediately went limp. Once inside, Hickson was nearly blinded by the light, but was unable to close his eyes. He saw no furniture inside, only a screen-like device on the wall. He hung suspended in the air at a 45-degree angle while an eye-like device appeared out of the wall in front of his face and circled around him. The beings who held Hickson during this examination moved in a stiff mechanical way, but did their work with speed and efficiency. One made a buzzing sound. The beings then disappeared for some time. When they returned, they grasped Hickson again and floated him through the opening, which had reappeared and took him back to the place where they had found him. His legs collapsed when he touched the ground. Parker stood by with a terrified look on his face. Meanwhile, the buzzing sound of blue light resumed, and the craft rose straight up and disappeared almost instantly. Hickson heard a message in his mind that the beings were peaceful. Though the 2 witnesses knew they would be ridiculed, they nevertheless told their story to the police. Members of the Boko Haram terrorist organization in Nigeria claim they are being attacked by the ghosts of their victims who have, quote, possessed the bodies of snakes and bees. The men, arrested last week at Mairi Ward, behind University of Maiduguri, by members of the civilian JTF vigilante group, say most of them are leaving the Sambisa forest and running to Borno State in order to escape the deadly encounters. Quote, most of us are fleeing because there are too many snakes and bees now in the forest. Once they bite, they disappear and the victims do not last for 24 hours, terrorist Kolo Mustafa told Nigerian newspaper Vanguard. We were told that the aggrieved people who had suffered from our deadly mission, including the ghosts of some of those we killed, are the ones turning into the snakes and bees. Our leaders fled too. Umar Abor, another member, says they decided to flee the forest when the attacks began, which are, quote, the result of Chibok abducted schoolgirls. Boko Haram is the group responsible for the kidnapping of 219 Nigerian girls 2 months ago, and according to their leader, they are planning to sell them. Quote, our leaders told us that it was our enemies and aggrieved people that are hunting us through diabolical means. We were in the forest in 2010 and 2011. We left and came back last year, but we have never experienced such attacks, the insurgents said. Kidnappers believe the Chibok people are using juju, a type of witchcraft in West Africa, in order to get back at them for taking their children. The men are now promising that they have realized their mistakes and that if their lives are spared, they will help the authorities catch more of the group's members. Winston-Salem, North Carolina. A woman in North Carolina says she saw a creature that looked like a werewolf. 26-year-old T.I. told Cryptozoology News on Thursday that she was driving her son to her mother's house when she encountered the creature in 2017. There are a lot of woods there. I was gonna get out of the car, she said. Looking to the right, I saw what looked like a wolf, but much taller and white or yellowish eyes. The unusual canine, she adds, howled when the eyewitness got out of the car. I grabbed my son and ran to my mother's door. As I looked back, the animal seemed gone, but while knocking on the door, I looked back again and noticed something black running away. I can tell he was mad. The woman described the animal as a 6-foot-tall black werewolf with white and yellow eyes and claims that it stood there for about 3 minutes. The Dogman is a cryptid reputed to live in the northwestern quadrant of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, although other sightings have been documented in other states, such as Wisconsin. This unproven creature was first reportedly spotted in 1887 by 2 lumberjacks, who described it as having a human body and a dog's head. Last year, a woman in Michigan claimed to have seen a human-like wolf. In the fall of 2016, a Canadian businessman told Cryptozoology News he had spotted a creature that looked like a wolf walking upright while driving through Wisconsin. 7 months earlier, a 13-year-old in Muskego, Wisconsin, allegedly had an encounter with a similar creature. January 29th, 1953, in Conway, South Carolina. Hearing a commotion in his barn, a farmer observed an object about 7 meters long and 4 meters wide at treetop level. It was light gray in color and lit up inside. It resembled a half egg. The witness fired his gun at the object. Numerous livestock died mysteriously in the area after the sighting. May 20th, 1953, 1830 hours, in Brush Creek, California, two miners, John Q. Black, 48, and John Van Allen, reported that an object, silvery, 2.5 meters in diameter, 2 meters thick, with a tripod landing gear, landed on a sandbar 50 meters away from them. An occupant described as a broad-shouldered dwarf wearing clothing that covered the head and the trunk was also seen. His arms and legs were covered with tweed-like cloth fastened at the wrists and ankles. He filled a shiny pail with water and handed it to someone inside the craft. He then appeared to notice Black and jumped into the craft, which made a hissing sound and departed. On June 18, 1953, at 02:30 hours, in Houston, Texas, Howard Phillips, Hilda Walker, and Judy Myers saw in a garden at 118 East 3rd Street a strange shadow on the lawn, which resembled a flying man. They watched it take off. June 20th, 1953, 1830 hours, Brush Creek, California, John Q. Black, witness of the May 20th incident, observed an exact repetition of the scene, including the little man. Van Allen saw only the landing marks about 30 centimeters wide and resembling elephant tracks. June 24th, 1953, 018 hours, Hampton Bay, Long Island. A civilian woman saw something like a large aircraft flying very slowly and low. It had a lighted red band around the middle and was coming straight toward her house with an oscillating motion. She still thought it was an aircraft of some new design when it stopped near her, 25 meters above ground. Then it flew backward over the water and hovered, making the same noises as a swarm of bees. The top section supported a series of red lights and a cabin with 4 portholes through which a control panel was visible. No occupant was seen. The cabin rose above the object, rotated, then glided back. The object tilted toward the west and rose toward the southeast, disappearing within 3 seconds at an 80-degree angle of climb after the 3-minute sighting. Diameter 30 meters. 2 days later, a yellowish moss was observed at the site. A report of a strange event from Christmas Island in the Indian Ocean. Officers on vessel off west coast saw UFO through binoculars. It was squat and cylindrical with pale blue light underneath and another light on dome above. It appeared stationary, only disappearing after nearly 1.5 hours. Did not look like weather balloon, and too early and too slow for satellite. 20th January 1983. Now some strange events from Colombia. In Anchicaya, American Peace Corps worker saw a luminous ghost in the jungle, June 1978. The Andes Mountains, reports of 4 to 5 foot hair-covered humanoids called Shiru. On Olaima, UFOs seen from a rural farm by 11 witnesses, some of whom got to within 20 feet of it and saw an entity inside. 2 days later, he was taken ill and died from gastroenteritis, possibly caused by exposure to radiation, 4th July 1969. Near Ibagu, 4 boys saw tiny entities in muddy riverbed, 10th August 1973. Now one event from the Congo. At Lake Tele in Litkoala off Herbes River, sightings of water monster known as Mokila Mabembe, a possible prehistoric survival, and other mystery animals. And one event from Cuba. In Havana, several reported sightings of an apparition of the Blessed Virgin Mary standing on the waters of Havana Bay. A smiling, olive-skinned woman dressed in white. She has long dark hair and stretches out her arms. Late 1970s.
That was a public service announcement designed to scare the shit out.
I mentioned on another episode that one of the beings I know is a type of being that is analogous to the elves of fiction. So I'll just refer to her as the elf from now on. Sometimes they're called Nordics or Palladians. I don't know, it gets complicated. Sometimes spirit people from Venus are said to be tall with blonde hair, so that gets all mixed up. Anyway, the elf I know is tall, blonde, and looks somewhat like a Valkyrie or Amazon warrior with pointed ears. And I know the pointed ears seem like a ridiculous cliche, but, you know, fantasy and sci-fi beings from the Vulcans in Star Trek to Link and Zelda to the elves in Lord of the Rings all have pointed ears. She says that this is partly because her people have been subconsciously influencing our fiction for ages now. Some of it isn't so subconscious, as many elves in modern fiction are based on mythology and folklore which were inspired by people's ancient interactions with them, back when they were much more physically present in our world. She claims that Tolkien was subconsciously influenced by her people specifically to create the whole Middle-earth mythology of which her people, the elves, play a huge part. She insists that Peter Jackson is a reincarnation of a dwarf-type being and that he and his crew were chosen by them in a way, albeit a spiritual, subconscious way, no actual physical meeting took place, to, you know, bring the whole Lord of the Rings deal back into the popular consciousness with those movies. She also, more fantastically, asserts that Star Trek's creation was directly influenced by her people. She goes so far as to say that Gene Roddenberry was contacted by her people directly in order to create Star Trek. They are represented in Star Trek by the Vulcans and Romulans, High Elves and Dark Elves respectively, if you're going to use fantasy parallels. She says that the Klingons represent the dwarf and gnome types of beings, the Earth Kingdom, so to speak. Star Trek The Next Generation was not directly influenced by them like the original series was, but she says that there was still subconscious direction going on. For instance, the Borg are strikingly similar to the nasty types of artificial greys with their mechanized mannerisms and hive mentality, and Ferengi are quite like the goblins of myth and the emaciated monster-like beings of some abduction accounts with their disgusting groveling behavior. She is human somehow, yet ascended in some way beyond physical existence. This state of ascension makes her of the same state of being as the aliens, even though she is quote-unquote human. So she is an ultra-terrestrial, so to speak, which is human. Even though I know other spirits who are passed on humans who are not ultra-terrestrials, they are not quote-unquote ascended in the same way, even though they are all non-physical spirits who are human. Oh boy. Attempting a taxonomy of the extra-dimensional is a complicated business. I think I have this written here so many times. Are people called Nordic, She, and Palladian, related to the fabled Ascended Masters in the Great White Brotherhood, but take note that has nothing to do with Nazi Aryan ideology. A lot of people make that mistake. In fact, she's furious when people assume that Palladians must be Aryans or fascists because they're blonde and tall and beautiful. And she says, though, that her people do have a relation in some way, shape, or form to Scandinavian people. And yes, she claims to be both human of this world and yet ultra-human and of another world. So I assume she's some sort of ascended human whose race transcended the physical world ages ago and moved to the stars. They also claim that the fabled Anunnaki and Arcturians of alternative archaeology were actually supremely advanced human races and not conquering aliens, enslaving and teaching humans. She also says I knew her before I was born as myself here. She says that she's been with me my whole life, actually. She was not one of the first spirits to introduce themselves to me here, which sounds a bit unexpected, but it has something to do with the fact that she came to me at a very young age, and it was kind of a semi-traumatic, like, contactee experience of sorts. She says it was that memory I have of seeing the light in my bedroom when I was a young child. But anyway, the details of the event are, well, I won't get into it. It's pretty personal, and I won't elaborate. But, she and my guide insist that I wouldn't be who I am now, and I wouldn't be able to interact and communicate with them if I hadn't had this experience, this impression put on me at a young age. And I don't remember what happened in the experience, though she's given me nothing but love and support since I've made contact with her, which is years ago at this point. Alright, now switching over a little, there are so many other beings I've had brief experiences with, or beings which human friends have had experiences with, or other beings which my spirit contacts have told me about, and then all the ones I've read about. So, like I said before, there are so many different ones. I can't even begin to know the tip of the iceberg, really. Animal spirits, plant spirits, machine elves, so to speak, geometry made of love, psyche-entangled centipede beasts, quote-unquote demons, astral shells, etheric larvae, dream intruders, expressions of superconsciousness, doppelgangers, servitors, giant abominations of the abyss, extra-dimensional artificial intelligences, giant rainbow serpents, on and on and on.
He was abducted by aliens earlier this afternoon. That little girl got lost under the bed and she went into an alternate dimension.
This article is called, "At least 4 known alien species have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. Former Canadian Defense Minister continues to blow the whistle." It was posted on collectiveevolution.com on January 6, 2014 by Arjun Walia. Paul Hellyer was the Canadian Minister of National Defense in the 1960s during the Cold War. He was responsible for combining the Canadian Air Force, Navy, and Army into what is known today as the Canadian Forces, and was the highest-ranking person on paper inside the Department of Defense for Canada. He is also the highest-ranking person among all G8 countries to openly discuss UFOs and extraterrestrials. He has been speaking about UFOs and extraterrestrials for quite some time now, and he recently made an appearance on RT News stating that there are at least 4 known alien species that have been visiting Earth for thousands of years. Upon retirement, Hellyer began to blow the whistle on UFOs and extraterrestrials. His testimony is backed up by hundreds of other high-ranking military and political personnel all over the world, along with official documents released by dozens of governments worldwide that have officially acknowledged the presence of UFOs. It's also important to point out that the Canadian government recently acknowledged the fact that various federal agencies, including Transport Canada, the RCMP, and the Department of National Defense, used to track and investigate UFO sightings. They claim to have stopped those programs, but that contradicts Hellyer's claims. There's good reason to believe, and a lot of evidence to suggest, that some of these UFOs are indeed extraterrestrial spacecraft rather than military, and the activities of the agencies responsible for these programs go far beyond just tracking them, and into actually contact with various extraterrestrial races, other classified technological developments, and more. And now some excerpts from his interview. Quote, "In one of the cases during the Cold War, 1961, There were about 50 UFOs in formation flying south from Russia across Europe. The Supreme Allied Commander was very concerned and about ready to press the panic button when they turned around and went back over the North Pole. So they decided to do an investigation, and they investigated for 3 years, and they decided that, with absolute certainty, 4 different species at least, have been visiting this planet for thousands of years. There's been a lot more activity in the last few decades, since we invented the atomic bomb, and they are very concerned about that, and the fact that we might use it again, because the whole cosmos is a unity, and it affects not just us, but other people in the cosmos. They're very much afraid that we might be stupid enough to start using atomic weapons again, and this would be very bad for us and them as well. They have different agendas, nearly all benign and benevolent. They want to help us, but there may be 1 or 2 species which do not. They come from various places. For a long while, I only knew about ones that came from different star systems. There are some in our star system. There are actually extraterrestrials who live on the planet called Andromeda, which is one of the moons of Saturn, and that there are others on Venus and some on Mars, and that they may be interacting between themselves, because there is what is called a federation of these people, and they have rules. For example, one of the rules is that they don't interfere with our affairs unless they are invited to. They have accepted the fact that this is our planet and that we have the right to run it, but they are very, very concerned. They don't think we are good stewards of our planet. We are clear-cutting our forests, and we're polluting our rivers and our lakes, and we're dumping sewage in the oceans. And we're doing all sorts of things which are not what good stewards of their homes should be doing, and they don't like that, and they've made it very clear. And as a matter of fact, they have given us a warning, and this has come from more than one source. Decades ago, visitors from other planets warned us about where we were headed and offered to help. But instead, we, or at least some of us, interpreted their visits as a threat and decided to shoot first and ask questions after. The inevitable result was that some of our planes were lost, but how many were due to retaliation and how many were a result of our own stupidity is a moot point. It is ironic that the US would begin a devastating war, allegedly in search of weapons of mass destruction, when the most worrisome developments in this field are occurring in your own backyard. It is ironic that the US should be fighting monstrously expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, allegedly to bring democracy to those countries, when it itself can no longer claim to be called a democracy, when trillions, and I mean thousands of billions of dollars have been spent on projects about which both the Congress and the Commander-in-Chief have been deliberately kept in the dark.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called The Alien God Species. It was posted to disinfo.com on April 6, 2015 by Robert Torres. There is a species of extraterrestrials that are often referred to as being mythological, but in fact are very real. I call them the Watchers or the God species. I know this because I believe I encountered one and it altered my entire reality. At first and for the longest time, I believed my encounter was with a UFO. It wasn't until years later that I deduced it was an entity and that it was here for me. Why me? It's as if someone lifted a curtain, wanting to reveal to me a certain amount of esoteric knowledge. I've read that this is rare, but that throughout history this is the way it has always been done. In most esoteric belief systems, it usually takes years of disciplined meditation, study, ritual, or by other means, to attain this secret knowledge. For the chosen few, the circumstances are frequently described similarly. A light coming down from the sky, an entity materializes often with a vision or a message. In my case, there is no immediate message, but increasing peculiarities began to occur around me. In religion, esotericism, and ufology, the stories are similar. Beings of light or energy make contact. I'm comfortable accepting that this has happened to me. I also feel confident as to the reasons why. Why did I have these encounters? Why directly? Why more than once? I believe my mission is that of a channel, interpreter, and writer. Some contactees have reported receiving information, often about the future, telepathically or through dreams. This is also the case with me, as I often receive information that I couldn't possibly have known. Deciphering often chaotic information by making seemingly random connections or by using intuitive extrasensory means is the trick, deciding what should be revealed and how is another. It was several years later, after my second encounter, that I put it together. The mounting number of inexplicable anomalies is what made me suspicious. It's what drove me to my lengthy and in-depth research, ultimately into alien species. What I found was nothing less than astonishing. It reinforced my suspicions that my encounter was with an entity and the source of most of the weirdness. First of all, the entity I saw, in retrospect, impressed me as godlike. It was an enormous, multicolored, luminous, cloud-like object about a mile in width. It was globular, slightly oval, made of luminous plasma with about a dozen distinct but separate colors. Each color was also globular. Changing shape and size with adjacent colors would either contract or expand in response. The colors were bright, saturated, and fluorescent, almost neon. The overall size never varied. It was completely silent, almost directly above me, and I appeared to be perfectly centered from left to right beneath it. After about 30 seconds, the thing just shot straight back and disappeared into a clear sky full of stars. Then after about 10 seconds, it just as suddenly came back to the exact position and size with all the colors in their exact same places. The speed was beyond belief. It took about a second to travel the distance. From a mile across to hundreds or even thousands of miles away in 1 second. It took no more than a second to return, too. I remember thinking, this is weird and I don't think it's from here. But here it was. This time it hovered for 10 seconds, both beautiful and silent. Then once again, it shot away for another couple of seconds before returning for the third time. Finally, it went back and forth 3 more times within a 5-second span, as if showing off its speed, and then it was gone. I stood there frozen another 30 seconds before suddenly being jolted by the realization of what I had just witnessed. I just started running faster than I'd ever run before. When I got home, heart pounding, out of breath, I frantically told my older brother, Frank, I just saw a UFO. So how many alien species are interacting with this planet? Many scientists throw out different numbers, but there are many different types visiting. We humans are a humanoid class 0 civilization on the Kardashev scale, named after Nikolai Kardashev in 1964 with type 1, 2, and 3. Then there are Greys, Nords, hybrids, and subclasses A, B, C, and so on. When someone sees an extraterrestrial, they usually know what they saw could be nothing else. It's easy for someone to say, I saw a gray humanoid or insect-like being. Many intelligent, well-educated people have reported seeing UFOs and others have encountered ETs. My first encounter was a humanoid and appeared as a child with dark blonde hair. Yet my second one was a very large plasma, and if it hadn't been for my subsequent altered realities, I may have never looked deeper. However, I did, and what I've found is that the God species is integrated throughout all the major human belief systems. Mythology, philosophy, science, religion, esotericism, and ufology all make mention of them. They have been here since before man and are often associated with creation theories. The demiurge, energy beings, thought beings, aeons, angels, deities, archons, and one of my favorites, the Watchers. Within the context of my definitions, they are not to be confused with the Nephilim. The Nephilim are usually defined as half-human and even demonic. I don't buy into that whole theory of UFOs being demonic illusions and trickery. Within the hierarchy of extraterrestrials, the God species are at the top. However, the Watchers are not recognized as ETs by most, but rather as angels. On March 5, 2009, speaking on the subject of ETs, Jesuit brother Guy Consolmagno, an astronomer at the Vatican Observatory, said, "The Bible has many references to or descriptions of non-human intelligent beings. After all, that's what angels are. Similarities are what connect them. Key amongst the similarities are appearance and abilities. They are usually described as non-material entities existing outside of our material space-time dimension. However, they are able to materialize in our dimension as energy, light, or other apparitions. They can also be completely invisible. They are highly evolved and don't need a craft to travel. I call them the God species because of these things and their supernatural powers. Alien theorists believe that the angels from the Bible and the Watchers from the Book of Enoch were actually aliens. Philosophy, Gnosticism, Kabbalah, esotericism, ufology all describe these exact same entities using different names. For instance, among different Gnostic sects or across belief systems, they are allegorically similar. Archons and archangels often play the same roles with the same powers, pneumatic creators which some believe created the material world and man. It is believed that throughout history these entities have been and still are steering world events. They don't act upon the lives of every human who encounters them, just as every plasma sighting isn't a watcher. I believe mine was because of the numerous anomalous events that have since transpired. In my latest book there are many examples of what I was experiencing. It was as if my thoughts and written words were being monitored. My writing seemed to be being manipulated and emulated in the material world. For instance, while I was writing about my encounter, a storm hit. On that exact beach, over 30 houses were destroyed, with some being washed away, but houses on other beaches in town were undamaged. Those houses were there for over 100 years, and no storm had ever occurred like that before in the history of my state. It seems strange that it happens during my lifetime while I'm writing about the exact beach. As I'm writing chapter after chapter, similar macro synchronicities were occurring, and I wrote about them as they happened. The types that were happening have to begin within what physicist David Bohm called pre-space, or the pre-existence process of material reality coming into being. Only a creator-type entity can generate the pre-existence leading up to the created scenarios of the multiple synchronicities I've been experiencing. I can imagine that only an entity having godlike powers would have these capabilities. The entities know what's going to happen before it happens because some humans' timelines are being controlled. From what I understand, many people have reported lingering or permanent altered realities after ET encounters. They experience increases in paranormal activity, increases in synchronicity, psi events, and so on. I will continue to research, learn, and write about this species in much more detail, and will share this knowledge as I do. This article was written using excerpts from the nonfiction book Synthesis, available at Amazon, and concepts from The Future, The Alien God Species by author Robert Torres.
Time has come to see the world as it is.
This article is called Thoughts on James Randi and His Flat Earth Conference for Superstitious Dorks. It was posted to disinfo.com on July 8, 2014 by Thad McCracken. I have a confession to make. Before I started writing for Disinfo about a year and a half ago, I wasn't really familiar with James Randi. I had heard his name come up a few times on the internet in comment threads regarding fringe spirituality, but that was about it. Much like Carl Sagan's utterly retarded book, The Demon-Haunted World, I wasn't super familiar with his MO. But the more I delved into this stuff, the more I realized I was always going to have to deal with superstitious idiots referencing his work. So finally, a couple of weeks ago, I decided to spend a minor amount of time on the interwebs actually digging into who this loser is and how he convinced a bunch of seemingly at least semi-intelligent people to passionately raise their pitchforks at anyone insinuating the legitimacy of Psi. After roughly an hour digging, I'd had enough, and more to the point, all I can say is, wow, really? This fucking guy? You're joking, right? Sadly, no. James Randi isn't the sad internet joke he should be. People take this half-wit seriously, and all the world's problems come down to men taking shit way too seriously, I might point out. Lord, they're even having a dumbass conference held in his honor later this week. They might as well call it the Wrong Side of History Conference, and guess what? He's even got a feature film about this big, brave adventure being a close-minded twat coming out. With those things in mind, now seems like as good a time as any for me to point out that if you bring up James Randi in any sort of argument regarding the reality of psi phenomenon or the potentialities of altered states of consciousness, ever, you're making yourself look like a total Philistine. Here's why. James Randi isn't a scientist. Hell, he doesn't even have a college education. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not a scientist either, and I'm also by no means super proud of my educational background. I have a BA in psychology from a football school, for God's sake. Go Buckeyes! But that'd be the thing. I wanted to study basic aspects of human psychology, such as altered states of consciousness, in a higher educational setting. In attempting to do so, I realized it was essentially impossible at the time, due partially to the efforts of hardline materialist crusaders like Randi. He lectures at universities quite often, apparently. So Randi isn't a scientist, then what is his background? Get this, he's a stage magician. No, really. A fucking stage magician. A practitioner of one of the most increasingly irrelevant forms of entertainment imaginable. I'm guessing stage magic currently ranks like maybe number 508 in the top grossing fields of performance entertainment, right behind, I don't know, snowmobile jumping and agility competitions for dogs. I just looked at the entertainment section of both the local Seattle alt weeklies, gajillions of music shows, stand-up comedy events, literature readings, films, etc. Didn't even find a single listing for stage magic. Not even on the depressing casino circuit. Can't say I've ever voluntarily gone to see a stage magic show in my adult life. And what is stage magic, really? Creating illusions, which is sort of why it's become so irrelevant. You see, back in the day, a lot of people watching stage magic did it so under the impression that its practitioners were in possession of legitimate mystical powers. Now we know it's smoke and mirrors. I mention this because it cuts to the heart of the problem with Randi. Part of the reason we know it's all smoke and mirrors has to do with the efforts of people like Harry Houdini pointing that out to the public quite exhaustively. For a long time, when this sort of endeavor was far more profitable, there was a horde of acts in the field pulling the wool over the public's eyes and claiming to have legitimate supernatural abilities. That's how they made their cash. We all sort of forgot this long history because these acts don't really exist anymore. I've not once in my life watched a stage magician who claimed he was doing anything outside the bounds of conventionally accepted science. But that's where the history of Randi's shtick is rooted, a magician's rivalry, really. And that'd be the funny thing. It's not even his own shtick. Randi just said, oh hey, Harry Houdini is so cool for exposing other magicians as frauds and being a staunch disbeliever in psi anything. I want to do the exact same thing. The problem is, again, that I don't see any stage magicians claiming supernatural abilities in this day and age, so why on earth would I be listening to a stage magician's opinions on matter of science? Goes right in tune with why on earth I would be listening to an evolutionary biologist's opinions on spirituality. More to the point, doesn't this guy's entire skill set and business acumen involve calculatedly creating illusions? Think about that for a minute, let it sink in. Under that, guys, let's review his famous $1 million challenge. This ruse is supposedly a triumph of rationality and science over superstition, but the fact that it's done by a freaking illusionist should make it beyond suspect to anyone with even a thread of critical thinking skills. All of the experiments have to be done by his methods and using his equipment. That's apparently a part of the challenge, as I found out. No, it's really that stupid, and here's where it gets spectacularly irrational. 3 teams of scientists have studied psi phenomenon at various institutions and concluded that there's something there. We've got a team of scientists at the Sony Corporation, pair research labs at Princeton, and the remote viewing studies done by the US military. Same conclusions. There's something going on that doesn't fit into our current paradigm of irresponsible consumerism. Another way of putting that would be, we know psi phenomenon is real, but we don't understand it much at all because we can't find the profit margin which would pay for more research. Goes against everything we believe in. And then you have Randi, who doesn't acknowledge the existence of any of these studies from what I can tell, hasn't even looked at the data, but uses the calculated sleight of hand of his $1 million challenge to create the illusion that all this stuff has been proven to be nonsense scientifically. It's a pretty convincing illusion, created by a professional illusionist, not a scientist mind you, with a stated bias against psi and a blatant monetary motive for inventing and perpetrating such a trick. People still bring it up to this day, just like they bring up how Doug and Dave created all the crop circles in the UK, even though that turned out to be 100% crap. We want to believe in happy little lies so badly that creating these illusions is incredibly profitable, unlike psi. But from a truly scientific perspective, what's more rational? Listening to the teams of scientists who studied conjoined mind telepathy, reading the data carefully, and talking about the implications of their research? Or instead continually citing the results of a magic trick perpetuated by a professional stage magician because you want to believe in the illusion the trick creates so desperately? I shouldn't have to tell you, but I will say this. Ron D and his cronies' illusion casting has now extended to the internet, where they spend their time feverishly finding loopholes and editing Wikipedia pages to eliminate traces of the legitimate psi research that has quite amazingly been conducted thus far, despite the insane cultural bias. Again, if they didn't have anything to hide, then why are they spending a ton of time and energy hiding shit? Answer, because they're sad little dorks who want the internet to reflect the great illusion they've devoted their entire lives to. The idea that people are just meat robots and that all forms of altered states of consciousness are meaningless. Humans are the center of the universe and that there is no greater intelligence beyond sober waking reality. Which brings me to my next point. The skeptical community are by and large a ginormous bunch of pussies. The tagline to this retardo conference actually includes the phrase, spreading a helpful and educational message to those who might be hurt by charlatans and unfounded belief. And yet, when I looked, there didn't seem to be a single talk about how religion is a bunch of bullshit or a corresponding discussion on how to bring it down, or at least transform it into something positive. This is an area where I have to give Richard Dawkins an enormous amount of credit. Now, don't get me wrong, as someone who was told recently that I'm a spirit medium in an incredibly odd astral contact encounter, it's not like I think all professional psychics are on the level. Quite the opposite. My experience calculatedly throwing myself into states of supernormal high madness has given me the distinct impression that most of the people claiming to be psychic or spirit mediums are at least partial frauds. Seriously, John Edward is a complete hack. I watched maybe 3 minutes of that Long Island medium chick on some talk show one day and was instantly calling bullshit before flipping the channel. The second they go into that cold reading routine, it should be pretty good indication that they're at least mostly full of shite. My honest take is that a lot of these people have legitimate psi abilities, but lie about them and exaggerate their accuracy to turn a buck. I suppose some thanks are in order to James Ronde and his ilk for pointing that out, but the real question would be why. Seriously, how much harm do these people do in the grand scheme of things? Pretty much nil in comparison to the massive wave of hyper-violence and sexual repression wrought by organized religion daily. If you were paying attention, in America alone, organized religion was recently used as a pretext to double the size of the military-industrial complex. Please don't forget George W. Bush got into office by pandering to evangelicals in an unprecedented manner. Lord, religion was just used as a justification to deny contraception to women by the Supreme fucking Court. Now, did the Supreme Court decide that people who believe in UFOs can set back women's rights? Nope. How many wars have been started in the name of aliens exactly? Psychics? How about the occult? None is the only answer to those questions, which is precisely my point. If you are a true skeptic with a concern for vulnerable people being manipulated by charlatans, then you'd spend all your time pointing out how little evidence there is for a historical Jesus, and how most of the stories in the Bible are derived from pre-existing shamanic sun god worship. Maybe you'd do experiments proving that we can't raise the dead, turn water into wine, or walk on water. Maybe you'd mention that Jesus never touches abortion or homosexuality in the Bible, and that those have become huge political issues for some bizarre reason. You'd probably also spend a great deal of your energy pointing out how many times the Bible has been translated throughout history, how iffy a process translating texts is, and how those translations were often done for purely political reasons. You'd take on all the world's popular faiths in a similar manner, and you'd expend most of your effort spreading this message in any way you could. But that's not what these supposed skeptics do. They take on little fish who aren't actually a threat to anyone. Why? Because they're pussies, pure and simple. Well, maybe pussy's a bit harsh or sexist. Conformist would be a better word. They're taking on fringe ideas that very few people take seriously and attacking people with very little cultural influence or power because it's easy and people cheer for them when they do it. Let's kick sand on some nerds' faces because it'll make all the jocks and cheerleaders like us. We so desperately want to be accepted by the jocks and cheerleaders. Cowardice and conformity, pure and simple. And speaking of conformity and cowardice, in my brief internet research on Ron D, I stumbled upon something odd. The guy's been gay his entire adult life, but just came out recently, apparently partially due to the brilliant biopic Milk. This means that the dude was gay and alive during the height of the Harvey Milk's gay rights activism, but was too afraid to admit to such publicly. But 30 years later, when they made a Hollywood film about it, he finally felt comfortable admitting this to society. How courageous. How many psychic and or alien cults have been suppressing homosexuality throughout the ages? On another note, rather than writing a book denouncing religion, Carl Sagan took on John Mack's work with alien contactees instead. What a big, brave choice for him as a scientist. Skeptics ain't got nothing on shamanism. Shamanism can be defined in a billion different ways and ventures into all kinds of freaky esoteric enclaves, but at its core, it involves the idea that humans can intentionally induce profound spiritual experiences through the ritualistic use of hallucinogenic compounds. Skeptics cannot and will not address whether or not this claim is valid, despite the fact that it runs contrary to everything they believe. Are you going to say that taking DMT doesn't make people trip balls? Yeah, but it does. There's really no argument there. You know how many studies have been done on it? 1. That's right, freaking 1. And the results seemingly confirmed what shamans have been telling us throughout history. Then there was the John Hopkins Christian mushroom study. How'd that turn out? Well, it seems like mushrooms do in fact induce spiritual experiences in those who ingest them, thusly verifying the long-standing shamanic claim. I suppose if you're a skeptic, your take on this is that our minds, if you must insist it's our minds, do all this crazy exotic shit for exactly no reason. Yeah, that's rational. Oh wait, no, it's psychotically superstitious. In fact, it seems utterly insane that our brains would do all these weird things like lucid dreaming and going out of body, and that all of these weird things have exactly no meaning. Why have we let this incredibly illogical belief persist for so long? Well, it's culturally sanctioned, that's why. We're so utterly terrified by the potentiality of psychedelics that we went and made them illegal. This illegality has made it essentially impossible to study them in an academic setting, although that's loosened slightly in the last 5 years or so. Where's the logic there? Seems like some supremely superstitious bullshit to me, particularly in a culture where big business is cramming narcotics and speed down our throats with an increasingly reckless devil-may-care abandon. Much like Psi Phenomenon, we don't know how to fit these things into a consumerist box, whereas getting people hooked on Adderall is obviously crazy profitable. What do skeptics say when you ask them why science should be government's bitch? Why should the government be able to tell scientists what they can and cannot study? That's where we've been with even weed for the most part, for the last 40 years or so. To say it set us back would be a bit of an understatement, and this is the superstitious lens through which the common skeptic sees the world. With that in mind, I devised my own challenge for any supposed true skeptic. Maybe in time I'll be rich enough to offer up a massive cash reward for this sort of thing. I've said for years that whether or not psi stuff is physically quote-unquote real or not is completely fucking irrelevant. What's important is that behavior is a physical thing, and that those who experience powerful transpersonal states will often also experience a corresponding change in attitude or behavior which are decidedly measurable. Maybe it's my background in psychology that led me to think about science in this manner, as it's how we study most other psychoactive medications in the mental health world. So here's the challenge. 1. Take a lie detector test confirming that you are in fact a hardline skeptical atheist. 2. Smoke DMT. 3. Experiment with Robert Monroe's techniques for astral projection. 4. Try an acid-based sex magic ritual designed per my specifications. 5. Pass a lie detector test confirming that you're still a hardline skeptical atheist. I truly doubt that anyone would make much past step 2 and be able to get through step 5, but anyway, I digress. That's about enough of my energy on James Rondia and his idiot minions. Since the guy's roughly 100, I'll end with a special message from Nathan Explosion from Metalocalypse. Go forth and die.
Science can explain everything if we look hard enough.
Shut up, science bitch.
Nothing is true. Everything is real.
Not only is he like ruining my life, but with all this God shit that he's into, he could be ruining my afterlife.
It's a sort of interdimensional vagina that somehow appears. I can interact with it.
Fabric of the entire universe could be torn apart.
I know my mind is changing. I'm already too far gone to know what to do.